Vietnam is not just a history lesson. It is a nation moving so relentlessly that the future feels like it arrived yesterday. Most people in the West still picture it through the faded lens of old Hollywood movies, but that cinematic version of the country has been gone for a very long time. The real Vietnam is quietly powering the very device you are holding right now. For decades, the Western mind has comfortably boxed this region into two distinct, unmoving categories. It is either a theater of historical tragedy or a tropical playground for the weary traveler. News networks and travel magazines have painted a persistent portrait of a land caught in amber. We see images of conical hats bobbing in endless green rice paddies, ancient temples shrouded in monsoon mist, and bustling night markets selling cheap street food under neon rain. The narrative sold in London, Sydney, and New York is one of a beautiful, chaotic, but ultimately passive corner of the world. It is a comforting illusion that allows outsiders to romanticize a place while completely underestimating its raw ambition. This romanticized filter strips away the underlying ferocity of a nation that has spent centuries fighting for its exact coordinates on the map. We expect them to survive, but we never anticipated them dictating the terms of global commerce. The collective memory of the West has been stubbornly slow to update its mental architecture. We still look for ghosts in the jungle canopy. We still listen for echoes of old conflicts, but the ground here has stopped shaking from the past. It is now vibrating with the relentless machinery of tomorrow. Beneath the heavy tropical clouds, an entirely different ecosystem has taken root. The quiet places where time supposedly walked barefoot have been paved with ambition and reinforced steel. Deep water ports are tearing into the coastline, swallowing cargo ships the size of small cities and spitting them back out into the arteries of global trade. The skyline is no longer defined just by limestone casts or the silhouettes of banyan trees against the dusk. It is jagged with construction cranes, glass towers, and sprawling industrial parks that stretch toward the horizon like metal rivers. This physical transformation is violent in its speed and uncompromising in its scale. Highways are slicing through terrain that once swallowed armies, connecting massive manufacturing hubs to global supply chains with surgical precision. The rural tranquility soared on postcards is actively being dismantled and reassembled into a fortress of modern production. It is a thick electric atmosphere born from millions of people collectively deciding to accelerate time. The rivers that once only carried salt and song now carry silicon, lithium, and the foundational components of the digital age. This is the geography of a quiet revolution. The earth here is no longer just enduring the elements. It is being bent, molded, and weaponized for economic dominance. But buildings and highways are merely the visible armor of a much deeper psychological shift. The true unseen force driving this landmass is a terrifyingly pragmatic collective mindset. This is a population that has weaponized its own geography, turning a historic vulnerability into an undeniable geopolitical asset for generations. Being squeezed between superpowers meant being a battlefield. Today, it means being the indispensable middleman in a fractured world. The strategic patience here is absolute. Every bridge built, every foreign direct investment approved, and every deep water channel dredged is part of a silent, sweeping orchestration. They are not simply reacting to the trade wars or the economic anxieties of the West. They are anticipating them, absorbing the panic of North American and European markets, and offering a concrete sanctuary for their most critical supply chains. The leadership and the people move with a synchronized purpose that democratic nations often struggle to comprehend. It is an alignment of will that turns chaos abroad into profit at home. They have studied the shifting tectonic plates of global power and positioned themselves exactly where the friction is most valuable. The world is changing its orbit, and they have quietly ensured they are the new center of gravity. To understand this place, you must strip away every preconceived notion of what a developing nation is supposed to look like. You must stop looking for the scars and start looking at the scaffolding. The transformation happening along this coastline is not a happy accident of global economics. It is not a temporary boom fueled by fleeting foreign interest or cheap labor. It is a deeply calculated maneuvering of geopolitical leverage. They are making themselves too important to fail, too critical to ignore, and too embedded in the Western way of life to ever be discarded. The romance of the past is a curtain they willingly leave drawn for the tourists. while the real work of empire building happens in the shadows of the assembly lines. They are rewriting the rules of engagement without ever firing a shot. The unyielding spirit that once defeated empires is now being channeled into outproducing them. This is the unseen reality of a nation that refuses to be a footnote in someone else's story. This is not just history, it is a calculated future. When you look at the map of Asia, the geography immediately tells a story of relentless pressure. The country curves along the eastern edge of the Indo-Chinese peninsula like a drawn bow facing the vast expanse of the Pacific. To a Western observer, the scale might be deceptive. In sheer landmass, it is roughly the size of New Mexico, or slightly larger than the United Kingdom. If you placed it on the coast of North America, it would stretch all the way from the cold harbors of Maine down to the warm waters of Florida. But unlike New Mexico or the British Isles, this land does not enjoy the luxury of quiet borders or an isolating oceanic moat. It is physically pinned against the edge of the world's most fiercely contested geopolitical fault line. To the north lies the immense historic weight of China. To the east lies one of the most critical maritime arteries on the planet, a body of water where nearly a third of all global shipping currently passes. So how does a nation of this size maintain its absolute autonomy when it is surrounded by the gravitational pull of superpowers? The answer is not found in ideological grandstanding. It is found in the dirt, the mountains, and the tides. This is a country that understands the permanent vulnerability of its own coordinates. They cannot relocate their borders. They cannot step away from the center of the chessboard. It is not an accident of history. It is a geographic destiny. Every empire that has ever sought to dominate the East has eventually had to look at this exact stretch of coastline. Living on this sliver of land requires a hyper-awareness that most nations never have to develop. Nations like Canada or Australia are blessed with the ultimate defense mechanism of sheer isolation. They are protected by vast oceans and friendly neighbors. This nation enjoys no such geographical privilege. The Annamite mountain range forms a rugged spine down the western border, creating a natural fortress of dense jungle and steep limestone, while the entire eastern flank is completely exposed to the open sea. This means they must constantly look outward toward the horizon while perpetually guarding the back. It is a physical duality that shapes the entire worldview. They are the gatekeepers to the Asian mainland and simultaneously the essential launchpad into the South China Sea. If a foreign power controls this coast, they control the flow of global capital. If a foreign power occupies these ports, they dictate the security of the entire region. The locals know this better than anyone sitting in a think tank in Washington or London. Their ancestors learned it through centuries of resistance. Therefore, their modern strategy is stripped of all naivety. It is practical, it is survival. There is no room for rigid alliances that might drag them into someone else's war. When your house is built in the middle of a strategic highway, you do not hand the keys over to the loudest driver. You learn how to direct the traffic. You make sure that every heavy vehicle that passes through your territory needs your roads to remain intact. But geography is only half the story, because the unseen Vietnam is how they have actively weaponized this spatial vulnerability, turning a historical curse into an undeniable geopolitical leverage. Instead of trying to hide from the immense pressure of the Pacific Rim, they have leaned directly into it. They realize that if every major world power fundamentally needs access to their coastline, then every major world power must be forced to invest in their stability. They have engineered a reality where an attack on their sovereignty would immediately trigger a massive disruption in the supply chains of North America, Europe, and East Asia. They are binding the world's economic security to their own national borders. It is a brilliant, silent form of deterrence. You do not need the largest navy on earth if the nations with the largest navies rely on your factories to function. This transforms their vulnerable location from a target into a sanctuary. When foreign policy is debated in Western capitals, it is often an abstract concept, a matter of moral positioning or distant strategic interests. Here, foreign policy is the very literal act of keeping the roof over your head from collapsing. They balance the intense gravity of the North with the heavy naval presence of the West, playing a high-stakes game of equilibrium that leaves no margin for error. They stand their ground not by building unscalable walls, but by ensuring their roots are intertwined with the foundations of the global economy. In the Western geopolitical tradition, security is almost always defined by the rigidity of the walls we build. We draft ironclad treaties, draw absolute lines in the sand, and form massive defense coalitions like NATO to deter our adversaries. To an American, British, or Canadian strategist, a formal military alliance is the ultimate non-negotiable guarantee of national survival. But in this fiercely contested corner of the Pacific, rigid lines are exactly what snap first under the immense pressure of competing empires. The true foundation of strength is not rigidity, but the calculated ability to bend. This is the core philosophy that dictates every move this country makes on the global chessboard. A concept so profoundly different from Western thinking that it requires a complete recalibration of how we view power. When analysts from Washington-based institutions like CSIS and the Heritage Foundation publish their 2024 and 2025 strategic assessments, they spend hundreds of pages dissecting this remarkably elegant doctrine. They call it bamboo diplomacy, just like the plant that dominates its tropical landscapes. The nation's foreign policy is structured around two distinct elements: an unyielding, deeply anchored root system and a canopy of incredibly flexible branches. The roots represent their non-negotiable core principles, which are absolute sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national independence. These roots were watered by centuries of devastating warfare and will never be compromised, but above the surface, the branches are designed to sway in the violent winds of global superpower competition. They will tilt toward Washington for technological investments, lean toward Beijing for cross-border trade, and reach out to Europe for free trade agreements. They engage with everyone, yet belong to no one. To a traditional diplomat from the West, this constant shifting might look like indecision or unreliability. In reality, it is a highly sophisticated, hyper-pragmatic survival mechanism. By refusing to be locked into a permanent binary choice between the East and the West, they ensure that no single foreign capital can ever dictate their domestic future. They have realized that in a multipolar world, the most dangerous place to stand is firmly on one side of a dividing line. But the unseen strategy of this nation is not just defined by the partnerships they cultivate, but by the absolute limits they place on them. This bamboo philosophy is strictly codified into a defensive framework known as the 4 No's, a policy that completely inverts the Western logic of deterrence. The rules are absolute: no participating in military alliances, no siding with one country to act against another, no hosting foreign military bases on their soil, and no using force or threatening to use force in international relations. To a public accustomed to the protective nuclear umbrella of NATO, this doctrine sounds terrifyingly exposed. How does a middle power nation survive in the shadow of giants without a heavily armed friend standing permanently in its corner? The answer lies in the brilliant manipulation of mutual deterrence. By explicitly rejecting military alliances, they systematically remove the very justification any superpower would use to preemptively attack them. They have actively engineered their territory to be a neutral zone of mutual economic benefit, rather than a contested military staging ground. If they were to host an American naval base, they would immediately become a primary target for Chinese missiles. If they signed a mutual defense pact with Beijing, they would instantly face crippling Western economic sanctions and isolation. The 4 No's policy acts as a geopolitical firewall designed to block the imported conflicts of other empires from spilling over their borders. It forces the international community to engage with them purely on the grounds of commerce, supply chain logistics, and mutual respect. They have looked at the brutal history of the 20th century, recognized that being a proxy for someone else's war is a permanent death sentence, and simply refused to play the game by foreign rules. It is a masterclass in strategic ambiguity. They have turned the deliberate lack of a formal military ally into their single most impenetrable shield, proving to the world that true independence is not about who you stand with, but who you have the courage to stand apart from. But this modern success hides a deeply difficult past. To truly understand why the bamboo bends, you have to look at the fire that forged it. Imagine a nation waking up in the late 1970s. The guns had finally gone silent, but the peace was suffocating. The physical landscape was shattered beyond recognition. Millions of acres of arable land were poisoned, stripped of life by chemicals and fire. Bridges were reduced to concrete dust. Entire cities and rural villages had to be painstakingly swept for unexploded ordnance before a single foundation could be poured. For the Western world, the conflict was over. It was a chapter quickly closed in history books and moved to the silver screen in Hollywood. But for the millions of people left standing in the craters, the hardest fight was just beginning. They were entirely alone. The international community locked its doors. A crippling global embargo descended like an iron curtain around the borders. Trade stopped completely. Foreign credit froze overnight. The only fragile lifeline was a distant, slowly collapsing Soviet bloc. The world moved on, leaving an entire population effectively marooned on their own ruined soil. The rhythm of daily life became a brutal arithmetic of survival. It was practical. It was desperate. Rice was heavily rationed, measured out in careful, anxious increments. Meat became a myth. Inflation spiraled out of control, eventually reaching hundreds of %. Money became worthless paper exchanged for dwindling supplies. Families tore down the rusted remains of military vehicles just to fashion basic farming tools. They collected scrap metal from fallen aircraft to forge pots, pans, and plows. This was a society reduced to its absolute most primal elements. There was no room for political theory when children were going to sleep hungry. There was no time for geopolitical posturing when the harvest failed and the monsoons flooded the remaining crops. The collective memory of this era is not written in textbooks, but burned into the minds of every citizen over the age of 50. They remember the eerie silence of empty markets. They remember the absolute crushing weight of total geopolitical isolation. This is the dark valley that forged their modern pragmatism. They learned the hardest possible way that being cut off from the global economy is a slow, quiet death. When you're pushed to the absolute brink of starvation, you do not just rebuild buildings, you rebuild your entire operating system. The turning point was born from sheer undeniable necessity. The rigid, closed-off ideologies of the immediate post-war years had to be dismantled. The bamboo could not be stiff, it had to bend or the entire nation would break. In the late 1980s, a massive collective pivot occurred. They called it renovation. It was a silent, radical agreement across the entire society to open the doors. They invited the world back in. They did not demand apologies. They did not hold on to the bitter venom of the past. Holding on to hatred is a luxury for those who do not have to build an economy from scratch. For a nation desperate to feed its future, forgiveness was not just a moral choice. It was the ultimate pragmatic strategy. They realized that the best revenge against a history of destruction was unprecedented economic prosperity. They began reaching out to former adversaries, to neighboring rivals, and to distant markets across the Pacific. They stripped away the hostility and replaced it with a relentless, terrifying work ethic. This collective trauma is the invisible engine driving everything you see today. The glittering skylines, the massive suspension bridges, and the sprawling industrial parks are not just monuments to global capitalism. They are monuments to human endurance. The executives and officials who now negotiate billion-dollar tech investments are the same people who once stood in line for a handful of rice. This generational memory is precisely why they will never allow themselves to be caught in another superpower trap. They will never let one single foreign capital hold the keys to their economy again. The bamboo philosophy is not some abstract diplomatic theory drafted in a sterile, air-conditioned office. It is a primal survival mechanism forged in the fires of an embargo, hammered out on empty stomachs, and perfected by a population that absolutely refused to disappear from the map. When you look at their relentless drive today, you're not just seeing economic ambition, you're seeing the velocity of a people who have outrun history. They learned that the world is entirely unforgiving, and the only way to secure your place in it is to make yourself absolutely indispensable. The unseen strategy of this nation is perhaps most visible in its ability to reconcile the irreconcilable. If you look at the diplomatic history of the 20th century, the playbook usually dictates that former enemies remain locked in a state of cold tension for generations. Bloodshed of that magnitude creates an institutional hatred that is passed down, codified into national identity, and used as a permanent political weapon. But here, the geopolitical calculus completely overrides the emotional weight of history. The leaders in Hanoi looked across the Pacific, not at the country that bombed their infrastructure back to the Stone Age, but at the largest consumer market on the planet. They saw an engine of capital and technological innovation that was absolutely vital for their own national resurrection. The United States, in turn, looked across the ocean and saw an indispensable geographic anchor in an increasingly volatile region. The mutual need was far stronger than the mutual resentment. This is not a story of romantic reconciliation or an apology tour. It is a story of two deeply pragmatic nations looking at a map and realizing that their future security depends on completely ignoring their past. They shook hands over the craters because the alternative was irrelevance. This quiet, calculated alignment culminated in an event that defied almost every conventional expectation in Washington, D.C. On September 11, 2023, the White House officially announced that the bilateral relationship between the United States and this Southeast Asian nation had been elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership. In the highly rigid, deeply hierarchical language of international diplomacy, this is not just a ceremonial title. It is the absolute highest diplomatic tier this country offers, a status it previously reserved only for global heavyweights like China, Russia, India, South Korea, and Japan. To place the United States directly onto this exclusive top-tier list alongside traditional Eastern allies is a move of breathtaking diplomatic audacity. It signals to the world that America is no longer viewed through the lens of a former adversary, but as an absolutely equal, foundational pillar of their modern economic security. For the architects of American foreign policy, this was a massive, desperately needed victory. They successfully integrated a key piece of the Asian supply chain into their strategic orbit without ever having to fire a shot or sign a mutual defense treaty. They secured access to critical minerals, semiconductor manufacturing capabilities, and a rapidly expanding middle class, all while effectively anchoring a massive geopolitical counterweight in the South China Sea. But this elevated partnership is not a surrender of autonomy. It is the ultimate manifestation of the bamboo philosophy in action. By bringing the United States into the highest level of diplomatic engagement, they did not choose a side. They actively neutralized the pressure to choose a side. They brought Washington into the room specifically to balance the heavy presence of Beijing and Moscow, ensuring that no single superpower could ever gain enough leverage to dictate their internal affairs. They have created a perfectly calibrated diplomatic ecosystem where competing empires are essentially forced to outbid each other for influence. When the United States invests billions in green energy and tech infrastructure here, they are doing so knowing that they are competing directly with investments from neighboring Asian giants. It is a brilliant high-stakes balancing act that requires an almost terrifying level of discipline to maintain. They have taken the very concept of a zero-sum game, a concept that dominates Western political thought, and completely dismantled it. They have proven that a nation does not need to forget its history in order to outgrow it. The craters are still there, hidden beneath the new factories, but the people have fundamentally decided that the future is vastly more profitable than the past. To the governments in London, Ottawa, and Canberra, the modern geopolitical landscape is increasingly viewed through a binary lens. The world is rapidly fracturing into two distinct economic and technological ecosystems, led by Washington on one side and Beijing on the other. For traditional Western allies, the choice is largely predetermined by historical ties and shared democratic values. But for a middle power situated directly on the fault line of this new Cold War, simply picking a side is not a strategy. It is a suicide pact. The unseen reality of this nation is how they have elevated non-alignment from a passive stance into an aggressive, highly lucrative diplomatic weapon. They are not hiding from the friction between the superpowers. They are actively monetizing it. They understand that as the United States and China attempt to decouple their economies, a massive vacuum is created in the global supply chain. By maintaining perfectly cordial top-tier relations with both Washington and Beijing simultaneously, they position themselves as the only viable bridge across an increasingly uncrossable divide. They become the essential neutral ground where Eastern manufacturing infrastructure can meet Western consumer demand without triggering tariffs or sanctions. It is a high-wire act performed without a net, balancing the overwhelming economic proximity of their northern neighbor against the crucial maritime security and technological capital offered by the West. If you're still here with us, then you're already part of the few who want more than the surface politics of the evening news. You understand that true geopolitical power is rarely about loud declarations, it is about quiet leverage. This nation's ability to walk the tightrope is largely due to their absolute refusal to let ideology dictate their economy. When American diplomats arrive in Hanoi to discuss expanding semiconductor supply chains or green energy transitions, they are welcomed with full state honors. When Chinese officials arrive weeks later to negotiate cross-border railway upgrades and increased agricultural trade, they receive the exact same level of deference. To a Western observer conditioned to view international relations as a zero-sum game, this can look like a contradiction. How can a country simultaneously embrace the architects of a free and open Indo-Pacific while deepening economic integration with the very power that strategy is designed to contain? The answer is that they do not view these relationships as mutually exclusive. They view them as mutually balancing. The heavy Chinese investment in raw materials and basic manufacturing prevents the economy from becoming entirely dependent on Western tech capital. Conversely, the deep integration with American and European markets ensures they will never become a purely captive client state of Beijing. They are effectively using the gravity of one superpower to counter the pull of the other, remaining suspended precisely in the center. This strategy of equilibrium is not without immense risk. It requires a diplomatic core that operates with the precision of a scalpel, constantly calculating the exact breaking point of both superpowers' patience. They must assure Beijing that their growing military and economic ties with Washington are not part of a containment strategy, while simultaneously assuring Washington that their shared border with China will not compromise Western intellectual property or supply chain security. It is a masterclass in strategic ambiguity that fascinates political scientists across the globe. They have effectively constructed a geopolitical force field by making themselves completely indispensable to both sides of the conflict. If either superpower attempts to force them into a binary choice, that superpower risks pushing them entirely into the arms of their rival. Therefore, the unspoken agreement among the world's largest economies is to simply let them be. They are allowed to bend the rules of the new Cold War because enforcing those rules would be too economically devastating for everyone involved. They have proven that in an era of terrifying global polarization, the most powerful position a nation can hold is not at the head of a coalition. It is standing firmly in the middle, holding the only bridge left intact. To understand this policy, you have to leave the grand diplomatic halls of the capital and drive to the northern provinces. This is where the abstract theories of geopolitical balancing are suddenly translated into concrete, steel, and silicon. As you leave the densely packed historical center of Hanoi and head outwards, the landscape shifts dramatically. The traditional imagery of narrow tube houses and ancient temples gives way to something entirely different. Vast, sprawling industrial parks appear on the horizon like entirely new cities rising from the earth. These are not sweatshops churning out cheap textiles or basic consumer goods. These are hyper-modern, highly secured fortresses of advanced manufacturing. The scale of these facilities is almost incomprehensible from the ground, requiring miles of newly paved highways just to handle the daily influx of cargo trucks and commuter buses. This is the physical manifestation of the bamboo philosophy. By explicitly refusing to take sides in the new Cold War, they have made their territory the safest, most attractive harbor for global capital seeking refuge from unpredictable tariffs and political volatility. So how does a neutral policy translate to global wealth? It translates into the single largest migration of technological supply chains in modern history. For decades, the global technology sector operated on a very simple premise. The intellectual property was generated in California, and the physical assembly was executed in East Asia. It was a highly optimized, incredibly fragile system that required absolute geopolitical stability to function. When that stability fractured in recent years, panic rippled through the boardrooms of every major tech giant in the West. Suddenly, the device in your pocket, the smartwatch on your wrist, and the laptop on your desk were held hostage by escalating trade wars and sudden embargoes. Multinational corporations needed a new location, one that offered the same level of disciplined labor and logistical efficiency, but without the geopolitical risk. They found it here. The government did not just open their doors, they aggressively rolled out the red carpet, offering massive tax incentives, streamlined customs procedures, and a fiercely protected neutral business environment. The result is a total industrial transformation that is reshaping the economic map of the entire region. The world's largest consumer electronics brands are quietly moving billion-dollar production lines out of their traditional hubs and reassembling them along this coastline. It is a quiet tectonic shift in global power, and it is happening right under the nose of the Western consumer. To truly grasp the sheer velocity of this transformation, you have to look at a province called Bac Ninh. Just a few decades ago, this area was almost entirely defined by its agricultural output. It was a quiet rural expanse of rice paddies and traditional craft villages, moving to the slow, predictable rhythm of the monsoons. Today, it is essentially the Silicon Valley of Southeast Asia. It is the beating heart of a high-tech manufacturing boom that is rewriting the rules of the global economy. By 2024, this single relatively small province set a staggering target of attracting $7 billion in foreign direct investment in just 1 year. The landscape has been completely consumed by the massive glowing logos of multinational tech conglomerates. It is the epicenter of a manufacturing miracle largely driven by Samsung, which has concentrated nearly half of its massive Vietnamese investment portfolio right here in these industrial parks. When a brand of that magnitude commits billions of dollars to a single location, it fundamentally alters the local gravity. It pulls in a massive ecosystem of specialized suppliers, logistics companies, and highly skilled engineers, creating a self-sustaining vortex of capital and innovation. The rice paddies have been buried under clean rooms, testing facilities, and automated assembly lines that run 24 hours a day. The farmers who once relied on the weather now watch their children graduate as software engineers and supply chain managers, stepping into a globalized economy that their parents could barely have imagined. This is not just a story of foreign investment, it is a story of a completely reimagined national identity, built on the foundations of geopolitical neutrality and raw economic ambition. But transforming a landscape requires more than just available land and geopolitical neutrality. It requires an execution speed that borders on the impossible. In the corporate boardrooms of Silicon Valley or the industrial headquarters in the American Midwest, international expansion is a notoriously slow, agonizing process. A major manufacturing project usually involves years of environmental reviews, local zoning debates, political lobbying, and endless bureaucratic friction. The prevailing assumption in the West is that developing nations are even slower, mired in corruption and red tape. This is where the unseen reality of the modern Vietnamese state completely shatters Western expectations. When a strategic opportunity arises, the machinery of the government does not just accelerate, it effectively warps time. They have recognized that in the hyper-competitive race to secure the world's supply chains, capital does not just go where it is welcome. Capital goes where it can move fastest. They are not merely competing on the cost of labor anymore, they are competing on the sheer velocity of execution. To understand what this looks like on the ground, you have to look at a specific event that unfolded in 2024. It involves a massive Taiwanese electronics manufacturer named Quanta Computer. Unless you are deeply embedded in the tech industry, you likely have never heard of them. But you absolutely know their biggest client. Quanta is one of the primary assembly partners for Apple, responsible for building the very MacBook laptops that millions of professionals in North America and Europe rely on every single day. As Apple began aggressively diversifying its manufacturing footprint away from a single point of failure in East Asia, Quanta needed a new home, and they needed it immediately. They decided to construct their 9th global factory in Nam Dinh, a coastal province in northern Vietnam. The initial investment was set at $120 million. In any Western democracy, an industrial project of this magnitude, involving a sprawling 22-hectare facility and thousands of future employees, would trigger a bureaucratic marathon. The paperwork alone would take months to navigate through various local, regional, and national agencies. Here, the entire process was effectively reduced to a stopwatch. Quanta executives finalized their decision and formally submitted their comprehensive investment dossier to the provincial authorities. The clock started ticking. The local government did not file the paperwork away in a queue. They convened immediately. Different departments that would normally operate in isolated silos were brought together to process the specific requirements of the project simultaneously. Environmental assessments, land use rights, power grid allocations, and tax structures were evaluated with military precision. By the time the sun set and rose again, the process was over. Exactly 24 hours after the initial submission, the provincial government officially issued the investment registration certificate to Quanta Computer. 24 hours. From a stack of highly complex corporate documents to a fully legally authorized 9-figure industrial project. This is not typical bureaucracy. This is a machine working at hyper speed. It is a level of governmental agility that leaves seasoned Western executives completely stunned. This incredibly aggressive timeline was not a lucky accident or a one-off administrative error. It was a highly publicized, deliberate demonstration of power. The provincial leaders knew that the global business press was watching. They knew that executives in Cupertino, California were closely monitoring how their suppliers were being treated. By ramming a massive Apple supplier through the bureaucratic pipeline in a single day, they sent a shockwave through the entire tech industry. They essentially broadcast a message to every multinational corporation desperately looking for a new manufacturing hub. If you bring your capital here, we will completely eliminate the friction. We will not just give you the land, we will warp the laws of administrative physics to get your assembly lines running before your competitors even finish their paperwork. This is how a country that was economically isolated just a few decades ago manages to absorb the most advanced manufacturing networks on Earth. They treat foreign direct investment with the exact same level of urgency and coordinated national effort that they once applied to military survival. The ambition here is raw, unapologetic, and frighteningly efficient. They are not just participating in the new global economy, they are daring the rest of the world to try and keep up. To truly understand the scale of this migration, you have to look past the macro-level government policies and examine the people who are actually executing the shift. Consider the perspective of Michael, a 50-year-old supply chain director based out of Chicago. For over 2 decades, his entire professional life operated on a highly predictable axis. His company designed consumer electronics in the American Midwest, and the components were seamlessly manufactured, assembled and shipped from a massive consolidated hub in East Asia. It was a well-oiled machine that ran with almost zero friction until the geopolitical tectonic plates began to shift. By early 2023, Michael was facing a nightmare scenario. Punishing new tariffs were eating into profit margins. The threat of sudden export bans was constantly looming, and the post-pandemic supply chain was still violently unpredictable. The board of directors issued a clear, non-negotiable directive: diversify the manufacturing base immediately or risk the survival of the entire product line. He was tasked with moving 30% of their production capacity out of their traditional stronghold and into an entirely new ecosystem within 12 months. This is a story that represents the quiet panic of thousands of Western executives over the last few years. Michael initially looked at options across South America and Eastern Europe, searching for a combination of skilled labor, political stability, and existing infrastructure. The search constantly pointed him back towards Southeast Asia, and specifically toward the rapidly expanding industrial zones outside of Hanoi. The decision to relocate was not driven by a romantic desire to explore a new culture. It was driven by cold-hard arithmetic and the desperate need to hedge against geopolitical risk. When Michael first arrived in the northern provinces to survey potential sites, his expectations were heavily managed by the outdated stereotypes that still linger in the West. He anticipated a steep learning curve, a severe lack of specialized component suppliers, and a workforce that would require years of foundational training to meet the rigorous quality control standards of the North American market. He was prepared for a slow, agonizing transition. What he found instead was a landscape that completely shattered his preconceived notions. He did not find an empty canvas. He found a fully formed, highly aggressive manufacturing ecosystem that was already operating at scale. The industrial park he visited in Bac Ninh was not just offering warehouse space. It was offering a plug-and-play solution. Within a 10-mile radius of his newly leased facility, he found specialized injection molding companies, precision tooling workshops, and advanced packaging suppliers. The supply chain was not something he had to painstakingly build from scratch. It was already there, meticulously arranged around the massive anchor investments of global tech giants. More importantly, he encountered a workforce that possessed a fierce, almost predatory hunger for upward mobility. The local engineers he interviewed were not just looking for jobs. They were aggressively absorbing Western management techniques and rapidly iterating on production processes. They were fluent in the exact technical language required to scale operations, and they worked with an intensity that reminded him of the early days of the Silicon Valley boom. Michael's experience is not an isolated anecdote. It is the new standard operating procedure for Western capital. His company successfully hit their 12-month diversification target, not because they were exceptionally brilliant planners, but because the local environment was engineered to completely eliminate failure. He found a system that anticipated the exact anxieties of foreign investors and systematically dismantled them. This is the unseen bridge connecting the boardrooms of Chicago, London, and Toronto directly to the assembly lines of Southeast Asia. The decisions being made by individuals like Michael are actively rewiring the global economy, moving billions of dollars of capital away from the epicenter of superpower conflict and securing it in a neutral harbor. They are proving that in the modern era, the most valuable commodity a nation can offer is not just cheap labor or natural resources. It is the absolute assurance of operational stability in an increasingly unstable world. The Western connection is no longer defined by history or ideology. It is defined by a shared, relentless pursuit of efficiency, forging an alliance that is quietly reshaping the future of global commerce. But rapid growth hides its own cracks. It is easy to look at the massive influx of foreign capital and the soaring skyscrapers and assume that this geopolitical maneuver has been executed flawlessly. However, the unseen reality of managing an industrial boom of this magnitude is that it places a terrifying amount of stress on the physical and administrative foundations of the country. They are essentially trying to build a first-world manufacturing infrastructure on top of a developing world grid. This is not a seamless transition. It is a highly volatile, constantly shifting balancing act, where the ambition of the state frequently collides with the hard limits of reality. When global tech giants relocate their operations, they do not just bring capital, they bring massive, uncompromising demands for electricity, clean water, and logistical bandwidth. The national power grid, historically designed to support agriculture and light industry, is now being asked to sustain massive server farms and energy-intensive semiconductor fabrication plants. This sudden, massive drain on resources creates critical bottlenecks. During the intense heat waves of recent summers, the government faced agonizing decisions, occasionally having to quietly ration power to residential areas just to ensure that the assembly lines of multinational corporations never stopped running. This friction extends far beyond the physical infrastructure. As Western companies deeply embed themselves into the local economy, they are bringing their own stringent corporate standards with them. In boardrooms across London and New York, environmental, social, and governance metrics, commonly known as ESG, are no longer optional marketing buzzwords. They are strict legal requirements for maintaining global investment. This creates a massive point of tension. Western tech giants are demanding access to clean, renewable energy to meet their aggressive corporate climate goals. But transitioning a rapidly industrializing nation away from cheap, reliable fossil fuels toward green energy is a phenomenally expensive and politically complex undertaking. The government in Hanoi is caught between the desperate need to keep the factories running today and the mounting pressure to completely overhaul their energy sector for tomorrow. If they fail to provide enough green energy, the very Western companies they worked so hard to attract will be forced by their own shareholders to pack up and leave. It is a constant high-stakes negotiation where the rules of global commerce are changing faster than the local infrastructure can adapt. Furthermore, this immense concentration of wealth and industry is fundamentally altering the social fabric of the nation. The rapid urbanization required to support these massive industrial parks creates a profound demographic shift. Millions of young people are leaving their ancestral villages in the rural provinces to seek higher-paying jobs on the assembly lines. While this lifts millions out of poverty, it also creates an intense strain on housing, healthcare, and education in the newly formed industrial hubs. The traditional safety nets of the extended family and the rural community are being replaced by the unpredictable dynamics of the global labor market. A sudden shift in American consumer demand or a sudden change in European trade policy can instantly ripple through these industrial zones, impacting the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of workers. They have successfully integrated themselves into the global economy, but in doing so, they have fully exposed their population to the volatile, unforgiving fluctuations of international capitalism. The bamboo philosophy protects them from foreign military aggression, but it cannot entirely insulate them from the brutal physics of global supply and demand. They are learning that true geopolitical leverage requires constant maintenance, and that the cost of being indispensable is living under a permanent, exhausting state of pressure. If you are still watching, you are seeing what most never will. You are looking past the superficial headlines and the outdated cinematic tropes to recognize the quiet architecture of the 21st century. The prevailing narrative in Western media often assumes that the future will be entirely written by the titans in Washington and Beijing. We are conditioned to believe that the tectonic shifts in global power are determined solely by the nations with the largest nuclear arsenals or the most dominant reserve currencies. But that is an incredibly narrow, deeply flawed understanding of how modern empires actually function. The reality is that the stability of the entire Western economic engine is increasingly reliant on the decisions made in the neutral spaces between the giants. The security of the smartphones we use to manage our lives, the laptops we use to run our businesses, and the green technologies we desperately need to transition our economies are now fundamentally anchored to the stability of this single S-shaped sliver of land in Southeast Asia. They have positioned themselves not as a passive participant in the New World Order, but as the essential keystone holding the entire structure together. This is the ultimate triumph of their geopolitical calculus. They have essentially hacked the global operating system. By stubbornly refusing to align with any single superpower, they have made themselves absolutely indispensable to all of them. They recognized early on that in a hyper-connected, deeply fractured world, the greatest defense mechanism is not isolation, and it is certainly not subordination. The greatest defense is integration. They have woven their own domestic survival so tightly into the fabric of the international supply chain that any threat to their sovereignty is immediately recognized as a direct threat to the economic security of North America, Europe, and East Asia. They do not need to project military force across the Pacific to protect their interests. The American tech giants and European manufacturers, heavily invested in their industrial parks, essentially act as an automated, multi-billion-dollar lobbying arm advocating for their continued stability in every major Western capital. They have turned the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of global capitalism into an impenetrable national shield. The implications of this strategy are profound, especially for those observing from the West. We can no longer afford to view this region merely as a tragic chapter in our own historical narratives or as an exotic backdrop for budget tourism. We must recognize it as a fiercely independent, highly calculated center of gravity. When the United States attempts to decouple from China, or when Europe seeks to diversify its strategic dependencies, they inevitably find themselves navigating the terms dictated by Hanoi. The leaders here are not simply reacting to the currents of global change. They are actively dredging the channels and directing the flow. They have taken the devastating legacy of the 20th century, a legacy of total war, crippling embargoes, and profound isolation, and forged it into a uniquely resilient national doctrine. They survived the fire, and they used the ashes to build a fortress. This is the unseen Vietnam. It is a nation that has completely redefined the concept of power for a middle-tier state in the modern era. They are proving that you do not need to be the largest player on the board to dictate the outcome of the game. You simply need to occupy the squares that everyone else desperately needs to pass through. They stand at the exact intersection of competing empires, absorbing the friction, managing the tension, and quietly accumulating leverage with every passing day. The world order is fundamentally shifting. The old alliances are fraying, and the geographic center of the global economy is rapidly moving eastward. In this new, highly volatile reality, the nations that survive will not be the ones with the thickest walls. The nations that survive will be the ones that have mastered the art of bending without ever breaking. This is a landscape that demands respect, not just for its beauty but for its relentless endurance. The world is changing, the tectonic plates of global power are shifting, and the bamboo bends, but it never breaks. They have proven that true strength lies not in the rigidity of alliances, but in the quiet, calculated mastery of the middle ground. As this new century unfolds, their coordinates on the map will only become more critical. So tell us, which emerging power should we explore next? India, Mexico, Brazil, or somewhere even more unexpected?